images that came out of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso recently, as a failed coup attempt recently took place there, and we saw some of the carnage that took place in recent weeks, thinking to ourselves once again, oh, this is just one of those backwards African nations with their coup attempts and their military dictatorships and juntas and that kind of thing. This isn't what happens in our part of the world, whatever part that may be. Well, here's an interesting story that came up around the same time. British Army could stage mutiny under Corbyn, says senior serving general. And this article notes that a senior serving general in the British Army has reportedly warned that if Jeremy Corbyn government could face a mutiny from the army if it tried to downgrade them. The unnamed general said members of the armed forces would begin directly and publicly challenging the Labour leader if he tried to scrap Trident, pull out of NATO, or announce any plans to emasculate and shrink the size of the armed forces. He told the Sunday Times the army just wouldn't stand for it. The general staff would not allow a prime minister to jeopardize the security of this country, and I think people would use whatever means possible, fair or foul, to prevent that. You can't put a maverick in charge of a country's security. Well, an ominous little quotation there, but one that hardly received a bat of an eyelid in the mainstream press, although that's a pretty amazing thing for someone in a high-ranking serving general to come out and make such statements, although it shouldn't at all be surprising. I mean, I think there are a couple of things we should take away from this story. One is that, as I pointed out back in episode 202 of the Corbett Report flagship podcast, How to Overthrow a Dictator, it doesn't really matter, like in Egypt, if you overthrow one particular political puppet figure from his perch of office, you are not really removing the fundamental underlying deep state structure that actually controls that society. So exactly as in the British example here on full display, even if someone like a Corbyn was actually genuinely interested in doing anything quote-unquote radical in sneer quotes, of course, like threatening to pull Britain out of NATO, well, the army would just up and throw him out of office. And that's the way it works. That's the way the powers that shouldn't be play this rigged game. And that's exactly why true change, fundamental change, radical quote-unquote change, will never, ever come through the ballot box. But I think another thing to take away from this is, I think, something that's kind of implied in this, that it wouldn't, I think, be the army acting all by itself and just sort of unilaterally here. I think there would be popular support, especially depending how the press threw its weight behind this argument, trying to paint the would-be coup leaders of the British coup as heroes for attempting to save the security of Britain. And I'm sure there'd be some staged events or whatever to threaten, oh, ISIS is now threatening Britain, and look at Corbyn trying to take Britain out of NATO, or whatever kind of ridiculous scenario is concocted. I'm sure the press would play its usual role as the mouthpiece for the real deep state powers by painting the coup leaders as those valiant heroes desperately trying to save the country. And I think that the underlying psychological point to be made here is that when and if the martial law takeover happens, it will be greeted with open arms by a vast majority of the population as, oh, this is the savior, this is what's going to save us. I think people will recognize this as part of the at least a subset of that problem, reaction, solution, modus operandi of the powers that shouldn't be. But in case you're incredulous on this point, well, as Zero Hedge noted in its article on this British military coup threat, there was a recent YouGov poll that showed that 41% of respondents, as opposed to 29% in the negative, 41% would actually support the U.S. military taking over the powers of federal government, and it's broken down by party affiliation here. And take the accuracy of these types of YouGov polls for what they're worth, but I think the underlying point is nonetheless an apt one, that at the time when this happens, when whatever is enacted, martial law, FEMA camps, whatever it may be, it will always be presented as a good and as the solution to whatever problems the media is pushing at that particular moment, that political moment. So I think, this is an important point to understand, that we tend to think of these types of things, it will be some sort of fascist, tyrannical takeover, and everyone will be cowering in fear and secretly hating and wishing for the overthrow of these jackbooted thugs who are marching in the streets with their weapons. But I think that's too cartoonish. I mean, obviously such a system would not last. It would not be designed to last. That sort of system is quickly overthrown, as was the case, actually, in Burkina Faso, when the coup was quickly put down by the army loyalists. But a much more insidious form of martial law takeover, or takeover generally, would be one in which it's treated as, oh, wouldn't it be a great thing? We need this for the security of the country, and welcomed not with people cowering in fear, but a ticker tape parade down Main Street. Hey, yay, the army's here to save the day. And that's invariably how it will be done. Well, anyway, this is just an observation that I've made based on a few different points here. The links for these different articles, of course, will be in the show notes for this video as always, but I think there's an important point to tease out here about the nature of the way that the changes in society are wrought, Fabian socialism style, bit by bit, just changing the public consciousness so they actually learn to desire the things which, at a different time, in a different generation, were genuinely feared. And so I will be writing more about this in my subscriber newsletter this week.